Tab Talks presents Unsolved. The Riddle of Soapy Sam. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, born in the 1800s, has confounded the wise for over 150 years by publishing a riddle that has yet to be solved. Famous for his oratory skills and belief in creationism, Wilberforce is known for his famous 1860 challenge to a presentation of Darwin's theory of evolution held at Oxford University. Wilberforce's use of sarcasm was met with a commanding retort from Thomas Huxley. It was documented that the debate became so heated that at one point a woman in the audience fainted and had to be removed from the auditorium. And Huxley became so incensed that he commented that he would rather be the ancestor of an ape than associated with the ignorance of Wilberforce. Wilberforce was the third son of famed abolitionist William Wilberforce, whom Wilberforce University, the first university to be owned and operated by African Americans, is named after. It was not uncommon for Samuel Wilberforce to regularly publish poems and riddles and then disclose the answer. However, in this instance, this particular riddle was discovered in his personal effects after his death. Dubbed with the nickname Soapy Sam because of a peculiar gesture he would make with his hands, this famous riddle to date has never been solved. The riddle goes like this: I'm the sweetest of sounds in orchestra heard, yet an orchestra never was seen. I'm a bird of gay plumage, yet less like a bird, nothing ever in nature was seen. Touch the earth, I expire, in water I die, in air I lose breath, yet can swim and can fly. Darkness destroys me, and light is my death, and I only keep going by holding my breath. If my name can't be guessed by a boy or a man, by a woman or girl, it certainly can. So, what do you think? The case of Amelia Earhart.
Only a short time ago, Amelia Earhart checked over every detail of her $80,000 flying laboratory in preparation for her round-the-world flight. This was to have been her greatest achievement, a sky dash of 28,000 miles. With her husband, George Palmer Putnam on right, she discussed the hazardous course which had been plotted for her by Fred Noonan, the navigator who embarked with Miss Earhart upon this great flight, a flight which was to have marked her retirement to aeronautical research. Then to a waiting world came news of disaster as the plane failed to reach tiny Howland Island in mid-Pacific. A British freighter, the Coast Guard, and the Navy sped to the search, the battleship Colorado steaming out from Honolulu under forced draft. From California, the aircraft carrier Lexington, with 3,000 men and 72 planes aboard, races into the distant Pacific to join the greatest searching party in the history of aviation.
Now, there has been a claim that in 1940, British officials recovered skeletal remains from Gardner or Nikumaroro Island. And while there was an initial finding that the skeletal remains were that of a Northern European woman, those findings were later refuted, and the skeletal remains were determined to be that of a large middle-aged man. With advances in technology and a reevaluation of the old evidence, they concluded that there's enough circumstantial evidence to call the finding the final resting place of Earhart. But of course, the debate continues, since there are many who still find the findings circumstantial and inconclusive. Homicide clearance rates. Did you know that in 2020, The homicide clearance rate in the United States dipped to around 50%. Let me state this another way. Only half of U.S. homicide cases are ever solved. That's right, only half, leaving America ranking at the bottom of Western nations for solving these heinous crimes. And there's been a downward spiral since 1965, with African American cases having the worst clearance rates. While there are statistics that report an unprecedented rise in crime over the past 2 years, the fact remains that murderers have a pretty high probability of getting away with it. Crop circles and pteroglyphs.
My name is John Root. I'm a naturalist. I've done this program many times at libraries and senior centers. So I didn't know anything about this phenomenon until about 10 years ago. I read a book called Secrets in the Fields by Freddie Silva. Up until that time, I had only vaguely heard about crop circles, and I thought of them as being something that happened in the 80s, and maybe people made them and maybe they didn't, and that kind of thing. I had no idea that they were happening every year. And since the 80s, they've been happening every year, and they've been becoming more and more complex, really. And there's such a wonderful variety of patterns. Perhaps looking at this cover slide here, this might be the first time that you've ever seen such a thing, right? When you think crop circles, perhaps you think circles. And as you can see, you're seeing a lot more than circles. I mean, you are seeing a lot of circles, but you're also seeing straight lines, you're seeing patterns. So on with the show, and I want to explain that in my research, I discovered that crop circles were not the only mysteriously appearing patterns out there on terra firma, or on water for that matter. So this term pteroglyph is a word that you can use to talk about anything, any mysterious designs, whether they're on land, any part of the land, not just crops, or on water. For example, here's one back in the mid-1970s, a circle. No question that that's a perfect circle. And is there a natural explanation for that? You know, that circle of ice? Well, we don't really know, but you'll see a lot of them. Now, here's the first photograph that I have that I've been able to find of a crop circle. 1978, there were actually 5 of these large circles in the field. If you roll a die and you get 5, that's what the pattern looked like. And there's the farmer's wife and her 2 daughters leaving the field. But I will say that previous generations of farmers and their families share many memories of, in fact, sometimes people will say, I remember when I was a child, we would play in them, you know, in those mysteriously appearing circles. So they certainly have been happening for quite some time. And now let's pause and think about, well, what is the meaning of a circle? Is there a possibility here that we're looking at sacred geometry? Is it a sacred symbol? After all, those people who study such things certainly believe that, yes, the circle is in fact a symbol of ineffable oneness, the indivisible fulfillment of the universe, and we could think of the circle as being a 2-dimensional representation of the sphere, which is itself an ultimate expression of unity, completeness, and integrity. So perhaps these circles are meant to be inspiring to us. And now, speaking of the history of crop circles, let's go way back. 1686. Robert Plot was a naturalist, and I'm a naturalist, so I experienced an affinity for him. And when he saw this in the field, and he was writing a book about the natural history of Staffordshire, well, he felt obliged to come up with at least some explanation of what had caused what he saw. And this is what he came up with, this illustration of something coming from the skies, a funnel shape with a square shape inside that would have created the design that he saw. Now, fast forward to 1983. 1 large circle in the center and 4 in the shape of what some people think might be a Celtic cross. And you can imagine how it really got people's attention, right? The next year, Sir Dennis Healy's wife saw a bright red light over the field when this was being, and these are almost all formed in the middle of the night. So she saw a bright red light over the field when this happened. And in this case, again, the same pattern that we're seeing here. In 1985, a strange white substance was found in the formation, which was thought to have been responsible for everybody developing severe chest complaints who smelled it. Virtually all the images that you have already seen and will be seeing are in southern England. The counties of Hampshire and Wiltshire in southern England. So there's a natural question, why are so many crop circles happening there? I would point out, though, that there are crop circles that happen elsewhere, here in the United States and Canada, other parts in Europe. It seems to be mostly a northern hemisphere phenomenon, but not entirely. But researchers, their sense of this, their understanding of what's happening. Think of all these sacred sites in southern England. You know, the Stonehenge and Avebury Circle and Silbury Hill, and I mean, there are just so many sacred sites. Why were they located there? And the answer seems to be that there's an aquifer, underground aquifer, and there's chalk right above it, in a layer of chalk. If you scratch the sod, you'll find it. And somehow, as water's percolating through and entering the aquifer, that seems to set up some strong electromagnetic currents that people who douse for energy, just like people douse for water, these people who douse for energy are actually able to experience. And I think that, we can assume that our ancestors also were aware of these energies, and that's why they located their sacred sites where they did, right there in southern England. So either these sacred sites are being honored by the crop circles, or maybe even the energies are being used to create them. That's an open question. So now we've got some circles with rings inside them, right? Rings of crop that are still standing, and 3 of them in the same field in 1986. And once again, in ice, there's a moat, isn't there? See the people right there, to give you a sense of scale? If you were a team of humans, how would you have done that? Okay, how would you, because to cut it, and I mean, I suppose it's possible, but it does lead us to wonder, right? So in '88, this one was accompanied by an extremely large geomagnetic disturbance that was measured by instruments there. And now, Gerald Hawkins is a pretty bright guy. He was the head of the Boston University astronomy department, and he wrote this book, Stonehenge Decoded. He realized that that Stonehenge, back in the day, a few thousand years ago, I guess, when this was built, it was erected to be a primitive computer that would predict the eclipses and an astronomical calendar every year at the equinoxes and that sort of thing. You'd be able to see the sun at a certain place. So Gerald Hawkins became interested in crop circles, and he decided to measure all of the circles that had happened so far. So he would measure how large is this circle, how large is this ring, how large is that ring, and he compared all of those measurements, and he realized that when he compared them to each other, some were exactly twice the size of others. Some were exactly 50% larger, or 1 and a quarter times, 25% larger. Each of these ratios that correspond to the notes of a major scale were also found when he compared the crop circles one to the other, but none of the ratios that correspond to the sharps and flats were found when he compared them. Clearly, this means that there was a kind of a riddle that whatever intelligence has been making these, and they certainly are made by intelligence, intended for that riddle to be solved, or was hoping for somehow, but no one was coming out and saying it, right? Now, this one is quite different from what you've been seeing. As you can see, those plants, I mean, I wish you could see it because that's the closest I can get. I don't have any better photograph. But those plants aren't all down inside each of those 3 circles. some of the plants are grouped, and they're 7 concentric rings and 48 spokes, which you can kind of vaguely see, right? The 7 concentric rings, the 48 spokes are much more difficult to see. How is that done? Well, some of the plants are in groups that are bent like this, some are bent like that, and some are bent like that. That is how that, now, how in the world would a team of people in the middle of the night been able to create that? 7 rings, 48 spokes in 3 different circles. Gerald Hawkins, the same fellow who realized the major scale was being represented by the sizes of those circles, he also discovered that, well, that's the Euclidean theorem, isn't it? This is one of the 4 Euclidean theorems. It's not just the fact that all the plants are down inside this circle. You can see that the way that plants are down is very intricate, isn't it? Very precisely arranged quadrants, you know, where the plants are either lying down like that or they're lying down like that. And all these are clearly made to be seen from the air. So you see, you know, some quadrants look lighter than others depending on how they're reflecting the light. It seems to be part of the art, right? Now, in 1990, we start to get more elaborate. And in fact, here's an example of, apart from these circles here, there are also these very narrow orbital rings, which you see. They are so narrow that you wouldn't be able to walk inside them without making them wider. They're only a few plants wide, right? So you would disrupt the circle, but you would make it wider by walking inside it. This seems to prove that no one, in fact, did walk inside those circles and made them, you know, flatten them mechanically or anything in order to make them. These are all in various crops in farmers' fields. So it could be wheat or barley or a whole variety of crops. Cheesefoot head, this formation, which it's been guessed perhaps this is a symbol of a vibrating tuning fork. And this one, I think, is kind of humorous, because here it is on Telegraph Hill, and doesn't this resemble a message, like a telegraph message, you know, with something beaming, right? These arcs here, beaming a message out to space or out to a destination. Now, here's a picture of a fellow. This fellow discovered this crop circle. He happened upon it, and he said, "Okay, take my picture in front of it." And as the photographer was taking the picture, this sphere fell, narrowly missing his head, right in front of him. Here's a magnification of it. Large quantities of these metal spheres were found on the edge of this field. Now, what's going on here? Well, could it be that the energy that created the crop formation also had and was still making these things fall from the sky? Okay, perhaps there's a meteor that was passing overhead that had been in the way of these energies that had been being beamed down to create those patterns. Now let's look at one of these patterns here, and we can see that they're very neat. I need to explain here that these parallel lines are called tram lines. In Britain, they call a truck a tram. And so they're in the fields, they want to be able to, predictably go in certain places, but they don't want to be driving all over their fields, so they stay inside those tram lines when they're when they're spraying the fields or when they're harvesting or whatever they need to do. So clearly this is, and so that gives you an idea of the scale. These tram lines are the width of a chassis, the width of a truck. Now, you can see that these are very neatly created circles and straight lines creating these rectangles here, and this rectangle here, which was right inside one of the tram lines. But what you don't see, unless you really sit down, and if you have the mind to do this sort of thing, you would discover that there is actually a large and sophisticated pattern with 3 5-pointed stars, several circles, other than the circles that are already there. In other words, what happened was that, and again, I'm not going to say who or what source of intelligence this is, but clearly there's a design that creates that. Well, let's look at this first step, just for a sake of explanation. If you make a circle, and this is the center of the circle, and make the circle exactly the right size so that it touches the edge of this circle, And then you create a 5-point star inside that circle and make it just so, right? Get one of those arms of the 5-pointed star right on the center line there. Look at what's happening here. It exactly touches the corner of this rectangle, exactly touches the corner of that rectangle, and exactly touches at 5 points the perimeter of the circle, doesn't it? Now what that means is that this circle had to be exactly that size and had to be exactly that distance from here. Otherwise, that wouldn't work, would it? These quote-unquote coincidences are not coincidences at all, right? It's part of the plan. And so you can see that at every other stage, there are other circles, you look at these other points where the rectangles, the corners of rectangles are touched, and you get the idea how this is a pattern. And then these circles and rectangles were created using that pattern, and then the pattern was basically erased. Because when we see the formation, we don't see all those circles and 5-pointed stars, do we? So that's part of the plan, if you will. And this is the final result. Now, this is clearly a sacred site in southern England, the Avery Stone Circle. Clearly, it's being honored with this beautiful formation, which you can understand why people would call this a web. Now, remember how you saw a lot of geometry that was used to make an earlier formation? Do you suppose there might be some geometry that's behind this one? Indeed, yes, there is, and there it is. So you can imagine that this series of concentric circles would be present for each of these. It's just done once, so you can see the idea. But for each of these circles, it would also be surrounded by concentric circles in order to make all these lines here. And notice they're, again, perfect 5-pointed star, the circle here, another 5-pointed star, another circle here. Everything fits just right. And then there are these seemingly random and perhaps humorous thought bubbles just attached off to the side. Now, often you'll notice that in a particular year there seem to be themes that are explored. It's almost like an artist exploring a particular theme. And here we certainly see heavenly bodies and orbital rings. And in this one, this is clearly meant to be our own solar system. This is the asteroid belt surrounding, well, there's the sun, and then there are 4 metallic planets, the smaller planets, of which we are the third. And there's, Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter are the other 3. But if you look at our orbit, this is the orbit that the Earth belongs on, but Earth is not there. The other 3 metallic planets, shall we say, are represented, aren't they? Well, where is Earth? Some people think that this might be a reference to the very obvious fact that when you're standing on planet Earth and looking into the skies, you can't see planet Earth as a heavenly body because you're standing on it. It's a question of perspective. Therefore, perhaps that's why Earth is not represented as being visible on this diagram. I don't have anything to say about any of these. I just want you to enjoy them. There are many such photos that, well, could this be double helix, right? Is that symbolic of the double helix? Perhaps. The double helix of DNA. And now we have Stonehenge right here, right across the street, this intricate pattern of circles, Julia set. Hard to even count how many circles that would be, all arranged very precisely. And here is the eyewitness account, because this happened in broad daylight. That's atypical. Usually the formations occur in the middle of the night. So here we have someone who watched it happening, a mist about 2 to 3 feet off the ground. It was spinning around. It was a circular shape, seemed to get bigger and bigger. The mist got bigger and bigger and swirled faster. There was a clear space between the ground and the mist. Strangest thing this person had ever seen, calm summer's day. Imagine if you had been there watching it too. And as if that's not impressive enough, the triple Julia set later that same month, look at the size of that pattern. Remember, these are tram lines where the trucks go on the field. These are huge formations, absolutely stunning. And each of these circles here has a standing tuft in the center. Just a little touch there, a little detail. Standing tuft of plants in the center of these circles. And could that be symbolic of the wheel of joy? Perhaps. Let me explain a fractal. Picture my hand, and picture if I was able to sprout hands, tiny hands, from each of the tips of my fingers and my thumb. Tiny hands have now sprouted. And then picture much tinier hands have sprouted from those fingers. That's called a fractal, a repeating pattern that goes on and gets smaller and smaller. So here we have a triangle, and then triangles are stuck on each of those sides to give you a 6-pointed star, and then triangles are stuck on each of those sides to give you this figure, and it can keep going on, right? But in this case, it doesn't keep going on. It just stops right there, and then these ornate circles around something right near something called Silbury Hill. Now, Silbury Hill is a very interesting public works project. Thousands of years ago, before there was any fossil fuels to move Earth with, people spent a lot of time and energy to make this huge hill. Why did they do it? Well, we've talked about electromagnetic energy on the Earth's surface flowing in the landscape. And if farmers put seeds, the seeds of their crops, on top of that circle, then they would get the same effect as the photo that I showed you earlier of the corn in 1991, the corn taken from the center of the crop circle that had been exposed to energy and was much more vigorous in its germination and more stress resistant. And that is in fact what John Burke, the B of BLT, he wrote this book, Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty, about this hill and about pyramids all over the world. He calculated, and here's the studies to prove it, germination of corn kernels placed on top of the Lost World Pyramid in Tikal on a morning with extremely powerful electrical activity compared to the controls. So there's the evidence. Another fractal. And there's the chalk that, someone a couple hundred years ago scraped away the sod to reveal a horse. You could do that. You could make anything you wanted, right? It's kind of a form of art, I guess. But this really doesn't have anything directly to do with the sacred or mysterious formations, because they're clearly understood how this is done. Could this be sacred geometry? This is Vesica Pisces, the fish, inside this. And there it is, right here and right here. This one, by the way, is a hoax. This one was done by people. And while superficially it might seem pretty elegant or, precise at any rate, but it does not seem to me as eloquent as the others. It doesn't have the, it's really pretty boring to me as I look at it. And it also, you might notice how there are these little white lines that connect these circles. Well, the real deal would never have those white lines connected. It's clearly someone used those as paths to get from one circle to the next.
To be continued.